What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Jeff Vandroux, attorney, CPA, bodybuilder, coder, maintainer of BTC Pay, Python library, Populist. Jeff has been featured in Bloomberg, Bitcoin Magazine, and CoinDesk. He's appeared on many notable podcasts and is the author of notable Medium posts like A Post-Capitalist Future, Localism, Subsidiary, and Other Topics, Reflections on Tales from the Crypt number 126, and Charity, Welfare, and Usury, The Capitalist Paradox. Jeff, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's get into the first thing. Now, I'm just kind of curious. What is the maintainer of the BTC Pay Python library do? And what does that even mean? I hear Python, I think snakes. I know it's coding. I know you're uploading the programs, but that's all I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very small library that interacts with the BTC Pay API. So the short story is, if you are trying to build, say, an e-commerce site or something like that, and you're building it in Python and you want to accept BTC Pay for payments, you could make use of this library as sort of a layer that would help you communicate with your BTC Pay server and sort of automate everything through the shopping cart and sort of all that sort of stuff. And it would also help you, track your payments, things like that. So it's basically it's not a very, that part of BTC Pay is a huge project. The Python library is just a little tiny, teeny piece of it. Not a ton of code involved in it that just helps you, like I said, interact with BTC Pay server if you've got a Python-based application that you're running. Python's a programming language.
Sure.
I should say.
What drives you or motivates you to take on this project or spearhead it, put your time and energy into it?
I just kind of did it for the hell of it. I didn't design the library. I sort of picked up maintaining it and added a few things to it because it didn't have a current maintainer at the time. So I went to school a very long time ago for computer science, actually before Python was even a language that was really in use. And so I had some level of background in it from undergrad. But I never had a job as a software engineer or anything like that. I didn't even end up finishing the computer science program at school. But, when I got more into Bitcoin, one of the things I did a couple years ago is I took Justin Moon's boot camp that he was giving at that time, which was taught in Python. It was a Bitcoin-related Python coding boot camp called Biddle Boot Camp. And I took it, and one of the things I started playing around with once I got back into coding was BTC Pay, which is not a Python based project in general, but it's written in C#. But I actually just kind of looked to see if there was any way that I could help or contribute. And one of the things I did was I ended up sort of taking over maintaining that library, because I built a Python-based plugin for it that helped it communicate with QuickBooks. So I was making use of the Python library. And then at that point, I just, Nicholas asked me if I'd be interested in taking over the maintaining the Python library. So I did.
Sure.
And it's, small project, doesn't require a big brain to do it, which made it perfect for me. And that's how I got involved in it.
Yeah, I think you got a big brain. You got some big brained ideas, and we're going to get into them momentarily. The next thing I kind of want to talk about, so I mean, you said you went to school for computer science in undergrad. Somewhere you picked up, your JD and your CPA. So I'm assuming you went to law school and then just picked up your CPA after that?
No, not quite. So I went to night school. I worked full-time, undergrad and law school, right? So I didn't really take school all that seriously, particularly undergrad. I was just working, and back in those days, you could still make a pretty good living without a college degree. So I did. I worked as a salesman. And, I did the computer science thing. I excelled at it, but I was like, well, I can keep doing this computer science major while I'm working, and it actually requires a decent amount of work, and there's no girls in computer science classes. Or like, I speak Spanish pretty well, so I could just major in Spanish instead. And those classes are essentially all female, and the classes aren't that difficult. So I was like, oh, this is like a no-brainer decision, right? I'll just finish my degree in Spanish. So I did. That's I got my undergraduate degree in Spanish. And then when I graduated, I was like, well, at this point, I knew I didn't want to be a salesman forever, but I didn't really know what else I wanted to do. So, I don't know if any of you guys have done like commission sales before, but it grinds on you after a while, right? I mean, you're dealing with the public all day in kind of a high pressure situation, right? You're spending your entire day all day making people buy stuff, persuading people to buy stuff. So I didn't want to do that. So I kind of just started looking for a profession where I thought I'd be pretty well set, something that required like licensure so that I'd, earn like a decent living. Not anybody could just sort of get involved in it. And, I bounced around a few different ideas. I was always kind of technical minded. So I thought, maybe getting involved on the tax side might work out for me in that way. And in my little town, there just happened to be a guy that was both an attorney and a CPA. And I realized that sort of made you more unique in the marketplace. It allowed you to do more interesting stuff if you had both, as opposed to just being a CPA or something like that. So I went to law school, which I also did at night. Now, keep in mind, at this point, I'd never taken an accounting class before. I've still never taken an accounting class in college. And I had a bachelor's degree in Spanish, and that was about it. So what I did was I went to, the first thing I did was I taught myself accounting from like a CPA exam prep book. And then I took the CPA exam and passed it. So at that point, you still can't be a CPA though, because to be a CPA, at least at that time in my state, you had to have a bachelor's degree. You had to have at least 150 credits, which I didn't have. Right, you'll need 120 for a bachelor's degree, but that's what I didn't have yet. You need 150 credits. At least 30 of your credits had to be in accounting, and you had to work under the supervision of a CPA for at least a year, like a full-time job. So what I did was CPA exam into obtaining a full-time job at a small accounting firm where I didn't get paid very much, but they were great to take me on and teach me. I don't think they even realized that my degree wasn't in accounting, because on my resume, I just put that I had a bachelor's degree and I passed the CPA exam. And passing the CPA exam is kind of all that matters, right? So I got that job and I worked there while I went to law school at night. Like, they were flexible and allowed me to not have to work like crazy hours or anything like that. And I would commute to law school at night. So what I did that for a year, and I had the experience requirement, and now I had the 150 credits because my law school credits counted. They were still credits. But I didn't have the 30 credits in accounting. So in New Jersey, we have a university called Thomas Edison State College that will give you credits for your life experience. So I went to Thomas Edison State College and said, like, hey, like, I had passed all 4 parts of the CPA exam on the first try, and I had been working in public accounting for a year. Will you guys give me 30 accounting credits based on that experience? And they said yes, predominantly based on the strength of having passed the CPA exam. So I had to pay for those credits, of course, but I didn't have to actually take classes or tests for them. It was just, I had to provide proof of everything, proof that I passed the CPA exam, proof that I'd been working in public accounting for a year.
Right. Proof of
and
work.
They gave me 30 credits in accounting on a pass-fail basis, but they were still college credits, and they weren't from the institution where I got my bachelor's degree, but that didn't matter. So at that point, I had all the requirements I needed to pass my state's licensing requirements. So I did.
Yeah.
And then around that same time, I also finished law school and took the bar exam and passed that. Bar exam, much, much easier than the CPA exam. Not even close. CPA exam, much, much, much harder, at least in my state. And
interesting.
Yeah, CPA exam is 4 parts. It's really 4 different exams. You take it in 4 parts. it just has a much bigger breadth of knowledge. Bar exams 2 days. You just sit down and you take it 2 days. You're done with it. So yeah, and at that point, I was licensed in both, right? And I knew that I kind of wanted to do my own thing, so I opened up my own firm right away as soon as both of my licensures were like finalized. In the beginning, Bitcoin didn't exist back then, so I didn't have any focus, obviously, at all with regard to Bitcoin. I just had a tax firm. I did tax returns. I did tax planning work. I did a lot of estate planning work back then too. Like in those days, the estate tax threshold was only $1 million. So a lot of people were paying federal estate tax. So they needed estate plans. They needed fancier estate plans because they needed to be very tax driven. That's not really the case anymore. Estate planning is not nearly as tax driven because for a married couple today, the federal estate tax threshold is almost $23 million. So the type of work that I used to do actually pretty much disappeared over the years. It just wasn't a thing that people needed anymore for regulatory reasons. Around that same time, I started to get involved with Bitcoin, bought Bitcoin myself. And I was like, well, wouldn't it be really cool if I could buy Bitcoin for myself in a tax advantage way through a retirement account? So I came up with the structure, the Keykeeper IRA, what now I refer to as the Keykeeper IRA structure. Then it didn't even have a name. For myself predominantly, right? I was like, well, this is for me.
Got it.
And I offered it to clients as like a thing around that time, but nobody cared. Most people had never heard of Bitcoin. The people that had heard of Bitcoin were like, if you were to talk to them about taxes, they thought you were a Fed. Funny story about that. I wrote an article for CoinDesk a million years ago, back when CoinDesk didn't even really have like professional journalists back then. They would accept just sort of open submissions. And it was about tax consequences of Bitcoin, real basic stuff. And this is back when you could still just have open comments under articles. All the comments were like, don't listen to this guy. He's a Fed. He's out to get us. You know what I mean? Like all this sort of stuff. That was the environment back then, right?
Right.
So nobody really cared for several years. I would do, for the first couple of years, I probably did none of these for clients. And then I was doing like 1 or 2 a year. You know what I mean? Stuff like that for just various oddballs. And then 2017 happened, right? And with the bull rally in 2017, all of a sudden there was sort of interest in this. Bitcoin, of course, and then a lot of it was like, shitcoiners too. Because the structure, I market it for Bitcoin because that's all I care about, but it works for
alternative
all
assets.
those shitcoins as well.
Right.
So, there was a lot of interest in it, and it started to become a bigger and bigger part of my practice. Even when the rally ended in 2017, it didn't just die off as an area, a practice area for me. And it just sort of has grown over time to now it's like 3/4 of what I do.
Right.
Is that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're very multifaceted. And so the first thing I do want to get into is the Keykeeper IRA. I don't know if you've connected the dots, but I'm a client. I'm under my legal name, not my show name, but I think it's fabulous. I think it's actually, taking a very different turn in 2020 with the COVID Care Act. So maybe can you just kind of like elaborate on what is Keykeeper IRA? How can people use it? I think this is a fabulous tool right now that not enough people have awareness of.
Sure, I appreciate that. So a lot of people out there have like a 401k from a prior employer, or maybe they already have money in an IRA, right? And they're kind of feel like they're locked into brokerage assets, right? Like stocks, bonds, mutual funds,
GBTC,
ETFs,
whatever.
Right, even GBTC, exactly.
Yep, exactly. They want exposure to Bitcoin in their 401k.
Exactly.
Or anything else, but just
in their retirement accounts, right? So part of, what the idea behind it is, wouldn't it be nice to be able to use those tax advantage funds to hold Bitcoin and to hold the Bitcoin directly such that you could hold your own keys? And that's advantageous, of course, for 2 reasons. Number one, if you're doing it in a way that you hold your own keys, you're sort of sticking with the ethos of not your keys, not your Bitcoin, right? And then number two, if you buy GBTC, first of all, you have to be an accredited investor. And even if you're not an accredited, even if you are an accredited investor, you're able to buy GBTC through a regular brokerage IRA. The fees are colossal. There's like a 2% annual assets under management fee that goes to the fund manager. It's huge, right?
Yep.
So you'd rather not have that giant fee eating up your returns.
Yeah, think about that scale.
So exactly right. So the largest obstacle to being able to do this and hold your, have this Bitcoin, hold your own keys within the auspices of a retirement account is that under federal law, to qualify as an IRA, there has to be a third-party custodian. And that third-party custodian has to basically be a bank, a trust company, or this other category called a licensed non-bank custodian that gets special IRS approval, right? So how do we get around that? I adapted a structure that had been used for several years before this for real estate investing through an IRA. And basically the way we get around it is, we set up this custodial account for you with an appropriate financial institution, but the only asset actually owned by your IRA is either a limited liability company or a trust. The structure works both ways, regardless of whether you use an LLC or a trust as that entity, but it's a state-to-state issue. Some states impose ridiculous requirements on LLCs like California does, so we use a trust in those states instead. The idea is the same. So this entity is the only asset owned by your IRA. You don't own the entity. It's owned by your IRA. However, you are the manager of the entity in the case of an LLC or the trustee of the entity in the case of a trust, which gives you the sole control over its assets. So any money that flows into your IRA is then immediately invested into this entity. And once it's in the entity, you have control over it. So that there's a lot of regulatory stuff about what has to be in the entity's operating agreement, et cetera, to make that work. But we handle that all for you. And then we help you get an account open on an exchange under the name and tax ID of the entity. It's very important. It can't be under your own name and social security number. You can use that exchange account to then go ahead and buy your Bitcoin. And you don't have to store it on the exchange, of course. You can transfer it off the exchange and custody it yourself as the manager of that LLC or as trustee of that trust. So long as you have to keep it very segregated. You can't mix it with your other, non-tax advantage Bitcoin. And that's basically, in a nutshell, how the structure works. If you're a self-employed person, we can actually, that's how it works for most people who are not self-employed. If you're a self-employed person and you own your own business, if you don't have any full-time employees, we can actually have it such that your company 401k, believe it or not, can hold Bitcoin and you can hold your own keys yourself. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way if you're self-employed and you have full-time employees. Then the 401k structure isn't available to you. You're stuck with the IRA structure. But that's sort of, what I spend more or less all my time doing all day.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I think it's a great service for Bitcoiners. I think it's a great service for anybody. I'm a client, and I'm not going to diss any other companies, but I will say that I did my own research. Everyone should do their own, and I found that Jeff's Keykeeper IRA was the best service available on cost and service, and he walks you through the whole process.
Yeah, and I just wanted to. I appreciate that. Just to touch on that point for a second, because I really do appreciate that. Our cost structure is a lot different from anybody else that does this. Most of the other players that allow like Bitcoin IRA exposure, they don't charge an upfront fee like I do, but they also charge recurring fees that are significantly higher. Oftentimes, they're expressed as a percentage of the value of the Bitcoin.
So think about how that scales.
Exactly, right. And with our structure, you pay me once to set up the legal structure, and that's it. You're done with me. You don't pay me again. So it's, at that point, you can buy and sell Bitcoin as much as you want. You have this entity has its own exchange account that has nothing to do with me, right? It's on a regular, normal exchange so that you can buy and sell as much as you want, and you're good to go. You're fully compliant with the IRS.
Yeah, and I'll add that I even transferred some I guess it's 401k money into Roth to incur taxes now, so that I'll never incur taxes again on my self-managed owned Bitcoin within my retirement plan again. And you know, I think that's a really powerful tool, and your service helps people achieve more sovereignty and independence, and get their ownership over their own stuff. So
I appreciate that, and that's a good point you made there too about the Roth thing. I mean, you can do this as a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. However, probably 70 to 80% of the ones that I do are Roth.
Well, you got to think about it. Right now, I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt, but right now in the current environment, taxes are low. If you can incur taxes maybe now, again, this is not financial advice. Do your own research. This is a philosophy show. But, you know, this could really help you, you know, manage your tax affairs and gain sovereignty. And Jeff will walk you through it. I want to get into a couple other topics because you just bring a lot to the table. So before we get into, you know, the thing that's really juicy, I just want to touch on bodybuilding. So,
yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, so you're a bodybuilder, and the thing that I really want to touch on there, and you're very public about it, and that's why I'm bringing it up. It's on your profile. But what I want to get at is I wonder how much of that is because it's low time preference for you, and it kind of like almost forces you to regulate or sustain a low time preference mentality. And I've heard you speak on it on other shows, and how you kind of compete every other year. And there's a lot of dietary aspects to that. And so I just kind of wanted to touch on that a bit. And then maybe just a final note, like I've kind of never been a weightlifter or anything, but I'm recognizing that like I got to start. My back is fucked up, and I need to take care of it. So, you know, I'm just kind of touching on that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned that. The dietary stuff is the big difference between being a competitive bodybuilder and a guy who lifts and looks good at the beach, but you know doesn't compete. I mean, the dietary stuff is the difference, right? Because I'll give you an example. When you're dieting down to get on stage for a show, and you'll see how this ties into what I'm talking about with self-discipline. You're not dieting down to a healthy level of body fat. You're dieting down to a level of body fat that is absolutely not sustainable. It's not going to hurt you to maintain that level of body fat in the short term, but that's why I generally compete like every other year. Mm-hmm. And when I say every other year, I might do a few shows that year, try to keep them close to each other time-wise.
Right, so you can kind of get in that box where you're in this unhealthy, non-sustainable mode, but then you kind of...
and you feel horrible.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you feel horrible, you have no energy, because the other point I should make is I compete in drug-tested natural bodybuilding too. It's a little bit different. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying there isn't a lot of self-discipline with enhanced bodybuilding. Enhanced is what we call non-drug tested bodybuilding. Sure. There's it's a different type of discipline. It's a different sport. But yeah, I mean, you feel terrible, and you're just not nearly as strong. You lose significant strength in getting ready for a show. I mean, and I'll give you the idea. I am 190 pounds sitting here right now, and I have a six-pack. Like it's not the most razor-sharp six-pack, but if I took my shirt off, you would definitely see all six of my abs, and I would look great at the beach, right? That's at 190 pounds. I'm 5'11". If I was going to compete, I'd probably be competing at about 170, maybe the low 170s. And I would have to start losing, close to 20 pounds to get on stage right now. That would take me probably about 4 or 5 months to get ready, because you can't lose that too quick. You'll lose all your muscle. So think about what an unhealthily lean level that is. Like if I'm already very, what by normal standards would be considered lean, and I have to drop another almost 20 pounds to get on stage. It's brutal, which is why it's mostly a self-discipline sport. It's genetic ability, right? A lot of stuff that I can't control. I have very, very long limbs. That's horrible for bodybuilding because my biceps and my quads just never look as impressive because they're stretched over a longer distance. I have extremely long limbs considering I'm only 5'11". I'm not 6'8" or something like that. But, if you want to go out there and put together your best package on stage, it's a self-discipline issue. It's just being able to lose all that weight and spend 4 or 5 months, like, in a diet, losing weight. And when I say in a diet, I mean, I'm dieting. I'm not eating junk I monitor what I'm eating all year round. It's just the sheer volume of what you're eating gets so low. I mean, by the time I got on stage this most recent time, I was almost down to 1,000 calories a day.
Wow.
And you're not doing that low of a caloric intake the whole time. You're ratcheting it down slowly over time, but it's very difficult. And the reason why, to get to your point, it's all just self-discipline. And I guess that probably on some level is a function of time preference, being able to, delay that gratification or have that level of self-discipline to put that level of work in.
Which is more rewarding to you, the affecting the self-discipline over time or competing?
Well, competing
and I
in
guess
bodybuilding...
it goes hand in hand because the discipline leads to what you're going to get in the competition. But I'm asking, do you care about the competition, or is it the journey of the discipline to get to the competition?
Oh, no, I care about the competition. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean... And I'm not even a guy. I mean, I've never won a show. The highest I've ever finished in a show is second. So I'm not.
You did get a special award for a certain class, I think.
For being old.
Yeah.
For
well, that counts for something. Okay. Yeah. No, I didn't want to cut you off.
Go ahead. Finish what you were saying.
Yeah. So you mentioned enhance. You're the natural, and not the natural. You're bodybuilding in a natural way. Would you have an opinion on the enhanced process? When I was going to high school, there were a lot of kids in my high school, my peers on the football. I played soccer, played basketball, but football team, lacrosse team, wrestling team. There was just a bunch of weightlifters trying to get girls. There was just steroids everywhere. When I got to college, it was a cosmetic thing. My opinion is you're above 18, I don't care. And I'll go further. I look at someone like Barry Bonds. I'm kind of psyched he did steroids because there were other guys doing steroids, doing things that were kind of maybe better on paper. But I'm I want to see the greatest ever take this medicine and do what he can do. If he wants to take the risk and the consequences of his actions for a low time preference, maybe results.
Yeah.
Or I should say high time preference results.
I'll do a CYA thing here real quick. I advise everybody listening to not break any laws and always check with your doctor.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
That said, I don't really have a problem with enhanced bodybuilding at all. And steroids in general too, because to be honest, based on the research and the data that we have, if you do a moderate amount of steroids in a smart way, you're going to look awesome. If you work as hard as me and you do a moderate amount of steroids in a smart way, and we have equal genetics, let's say,
sure,
you're going to look 1,000 times better than me. And you're probably going to be fine. It's probably not going to affect your longevity or your overall health. The issue is, and I don't have a problem with these guys doing it, you can't do, a moderate amount of steroids in a smart way and compete in enhanced bodybuilding. It's just not how it works. You have to take the drugs to a much more extreme level that probably is going to have damage to your health. There's ways to mitigate that. You'll see there are guys out there that competed in bodybuilding and do live long lives because even with under the auspices of being more extreme, they still did it the smartest way that they could. And they also probably just were better genetically suited to the drugs. That's another part that no one talks about. But for me, I never went enhanced because I wanted to be able to compete and I didn't want to have to do the drugs in such an extreme way. And if you don't do it in an extreme way and you try and compete, you're gonna look terrible compared to guys that do. You're just not going to be able to compete. So for me, natural was a no-brainer for that reason. But I definitely don't have a problem with people if you just are recreationally lifting and you don't want to compete and you want to do steroids. I would say just be smart about it. Get your blood work done. Do it in consultation with a doctor. And I don't really see anything wrong with that at all. The only time it would ever bother me is if you're doing steroids and you're trying to sneak into one of our shows and compete with us. You know what I mean?
Sure.
You have your own show. You have your own shows for that. Let us have our thing. Let us compete. That's our thing. But other than that, I mean, I certainly don't have, I have unnamed friends that do steroids,
Sure.
and, I would never try to talk them out of it or anything like that.
Right. Fair enough. Before we get into the real juicy stuff with the post-capitalism, post-capitalism future, how did you come to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, from gold, like most old guys.
All right.
Yeah,
right. Fair enough. So, a post-capitalist future. And I really wanted to dig into a lot of these ideas. I find myself just being riveted by your posts. And I don't have a lot of commentary in terms of agreement or disagreement. I'm nodding my head. So I guess it's agreement. I'm enthralled with this discussion that you're bringing to the table. So, like, just to kick off though, like you mentioned that each generation improves its lot as compared to the one before, but like an economic system can only last as long as that's happening. Yeah. So like how do you frame up, like, I mean, you talk a lot about, like, not the 20th century and what happened there, but you use a lot of terminology, like neoliberal, globalist, capitalist, social democracy, market socialism, socialism. So I'm just trying to, if you could level set a bit so that we can kind of get into some of these topics and just what these words mean to you before we go further. Because it's really important to the conversation, and I think you have a really good handle on what these terms mean, at least how you're going to conversate about them, and framing them up, because I think they get tossed around, for no pun intended, liberally.
Yeah, they do, and part of the issue is different people can define them differently, right? So, for instance, to a Marxist, the type of economic system that I talk about, they would still consider that capitalist, right? But a distributist wouldn't. So I'll just talk about the way that I sort of define these terms so that we can just at least be consistent. And sometimes maybe I'll even draw some distinctions on how other people may sort of define them. So, capitalism to me is basically a market-based economy, more or less, and a market-based economy where competition is held to sort of be inherently good, and where you do not want to interfere with the market itself. You don't, like in oh man, I'm drawing a blank right now.
Sure.
What Mises would call a hampered market, right? I'm not including that within the definition of capitalism for purposes of what I'm talking about. So we're in right now what I would still consider a capitalist society, and libertarians will balk at that because they'll say, like, oh, well, there's all these government regulations, there's all these things that affect the market. But the reason I still consider that capitalistic is because they're usually regulatory structures and other structures that are just designed to prop up the market system itself from collapsing. They're in fact not designed to hamper the market. They're designed to keep it going, at least for the benefit of the people that have the largest amounts of market power. Okay. So that's how I would, define a capitalist system. A socialist system to me is one that's based on socialized production, right? So meaning that you don't have private ownership of the means of production in the ways that we're used to. The workers are in control of the means of production, and that could be through, there are a zillion different flavors of socialism, right? I mean, you could have like libertarian socialists where there's not a state that's really mediating that, versus a Marxist-Leninist where there is a very centralized state that's mediating that. I won't get into all those distinctions right now, but those were the two sort of competing schools of thought, more or less, throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st. The 20th century specifically was sort of defined by the conflict between capitalist and socialist production. Mm-hmm. Now, there were other economic systems that were posited during that period that never really got too much traction. Mm-hmm. Okay. So social democracy, to me, which really did take off in the latter half of the 20th century, was more or less a attempt to prop up the capitalist system through transfers, right? You basically, the workers don't really have power in most social democratic systems that we see today. They're just thrown like tax transfer payments and stuff like that just to sort of keep the system going, prevent them from starving, creating trouble, revolting, things of that nature. And if you take that out far enough, social democracy, that sort of system, what'll start happening is, and this is, I think, what we're seeing right now, we're seeing a system where over time, what happens is capital always seems to basically tend to centralize. That seems to be the natural thing. Because if you have a market, eventually someone's going to win in that market, right? And when they win and they put their competitors out of business, their accumulation of capital is going to accelerate. We've seen this, many times throughout history. And then once capital fully accelerates to the point where you just say, let's say you have a small oligopoly of players that owned all the capital in a given market, that's when you end up at something that Hilaire Belloc would have called the servile state. And in the servile state, you have a small oligopoly that controls all the means of production, and they actually voluntarily throw benefits, whether they could be government benefits or private benefits. That distinction is useless for reasons we can talk about.
I find this insight to be amazing here.
Yeah, thank you. So they're going to throw benefits down to the people that are not part of that oligopoly. And why do they do that? They do that because they have to do that. Because what would happen otherwise is it would be in your benefit. If you're part of that surviving oligopoly, right, you still have to sell things to people. Because if you're not selling things to people, you're not making any, like the whole thing comes to a grinding halt. Like you need people to have enough income that they can buy your stuff. So you're at least going to throw them enough benefits so that they are able to feed themselves, show up to work, and buy stuff. You need people to do that. You can't avoid the necessity of people doing that. So you will throw them enough scraps to be able to do so. And that's where we're seeing proposals like the UBI is real popular nowadays. That's what the UBI is. The UBI is not a socialist proposal. It's quite the opposite. Whether you like it or not, a UBI is an uber capitalist, hyper capitalist proposal to the point where, I'll get the UBI.
Does that mean there's a billionaire behind Andrew Yang? You know what I mean? Like, did Andrew Yang come up on this on his own and billionaires are like, yeah, that's a great idea? Or they're like, why don't we need an Andrew Yang to come out on the other team and present this case that we want? Because I feel like what you're getting at is a very underhanded, sly trick by the owners. Because the recipients of social democracy do not think that they're aligned with the capitalists.
Yes.
And that's what I'm getting from what you're writing about, that this is like backhanded. And no one's connecting that dot, but I think you. Right? I shouldn't say no one. You're building on some other work, obviously, but I think that you're at the forefront of really, in my Twitter world, of getting that message out.
So there are two groups of people. One quick point, and then I want to address that point. Bloch referred to the servile state as the point where this has accelerated so far that this oligopoly was in total control, funneling benefits down to the lower classes who were essentially servile to them because they were fully dependent on these benefits. And that was sort of the end game of all this, which is where I think we unfortunately might be heading. I think we're there. Or maybe we're already there. Gradually then suddenly, but this is another gradually then suddenly. It's happening very quickly. Amazon is doing their own healthcare, which in a lot of ways is great. That's better than maybe the healthcare they were giving out, which is to your point. Like, they're giving things to people that they want and they need, but it's going to maybe take away from their motivation, incentive, or ability to get ahead. Well, and it takes away from their power and agency. Right. Even though it feels like you're getting agency. Correct. So there's two groups of people you mentioned out that you don't think people are connecting these dots. In mainstream politics, not so much. You're definitely right. there are people that are connecting these dots in different ways. And the first group are, so when you say Marxist, it's a weird term.
Well, yeah, you got to define that. Like I was like traveling with my friend on a train once, and he's one of the smartest people I know. He's not alive anymore today, but like super smart. He turned to me when he was like 24 years old. He's like, dude, Karl Marx says you got more in common, because we were talking about like commuting to New York City and being in the rat race and just, whatever. And he was like, dude, you got more in common with your coworker than your boss or your boss's boss. And I was like,
right.
Well, that makes Marxism sound great. So, but I don't know what Marxism is, if you want to lay it out.
And it's a great question. So, the reason it gets so conflated nowadays is people that are typically calling themselves Marxists on the internet and television are doing what I refer to as CIA Marxism. And the reason for that is because it's sort of, and I'm not a Marxist, right? So let me be clear about that. But the type of Marxism that's taught in the university system in the United States really isn't based on Marx's ideas. It's more based on ideas that came later during the mid to late 20th century that claim to be sort of intellectual successors to Marx. And those ideas, the reason I call it CIA Marxism, this is just true, what I'm about to say. People say it's a conspiracy theory, but this is well documented. We're funded by the CIA. I mean, the CIA, the Frankfurt School was one of the main progenitors of these ideas, which is where like critical race theory all springs from that stuff too. All this stuff like wokeism is the
from
successor
the CIA.
to all this. Yeah, that was all those ideas. Herbert Marcuse and that they all that stuff started in the mid to late 20th century, and those guys were CIA funded. The idea behind it was that it would move leftist energy away from sort of socializing the means of production and towards all these other ancillary issues, right? And that has become the dominant flavor of Marxism in the West that's taught in universities, etc. If you go back, and that's what people generally believe when they say, hey, I'm a Marxist, right? If you go back and actually read Marx's work, what's interesting about it is a couple things. Number one, it really has nothing to do with any of that stuff. Marx's work is not even really about socialism. Marx's work is about capitalism. It's a description, a critique, and it's a description and a critique of capitalism is essentially what it is. And it specifically, it really goes into the contradictions inherent within capitalism.
So does that make a Marxist anti-capitalism?
Yeah, you would be right. Marxism is anti-capitalist, right? I mean, it certainly is an anti-capitalist ideology. It doesn't really offer, if you want to say just the pure orthodox Marxism from Marx and Engels' writings, it doesn't really offer a solution to capitalism.
Okay.
It just
critiques.
Sort of breaks. It critiques it, and it exposes contradictions.
Is that fair? Is that fair? Like, I mean, capitalism's maybe not perfect. I don't think you think capitalism's perfect. Maybe, I don't know what you think of it as. Maybe I think we both agree that it's done a lot for the world in the 20th century. But I think what you're getting at is that it's run its course, and I think the word you use is ouroboros. It eats itself.
Right. It sort of eats itself.
So in that regard, maybe Marx was right, or had some interesting points.
Yeah. So his critiques of capitalism were actually very interesting. And the point I was trying to make is he also died while he was still writing, so we don't really know what he would have come up with. If he had lived longer. I don't know the answer to that.
Sure.
But his point was more so that, and I disagree with him on this point, that socialism, meaning a socialized means of production, was essentially inevitable due to all of these inherent contradictions within capitalism that he described, some of which line up with the contradictions that I mentioned in my writing, others of which don't. I don't agree with him that made socialism inevitable, because I think that the servile state is an alternative that the holders of capital would obviously strongly prefer, and I do think is workable. Unfortunately, I would wish it weren't workable, but I do think that is a workable system. So I don't think he's right about that, but his critiques of capitalism are very interesting. And you're right. if you actually went back and read Capital, or you read the Communist Manifesto or any of his other writings, it really wouldn't line up with what, people that are ranting and raving on the internet about being Marxists are talking about today. So the point where this whole conversation started was there are really two groups of people that are pointing out what you just said, that a lot of these things like the UBI are really in full alignment with the largest holders of capital.
Mm-hmm.
The first group is the anti-capitalist right, which is a growing faction of people, at least on the internet and in, the intelligentsia or whatever. And they might not even necessarily always call themselves anti-capitalist. They're just not free market people.
And they're on the
Certainly,
right? Anti-capitalist right,
yes,
you said?
but,
okay.
Yeah. So, and that can take a lot of different flavors. On some level, I'm probably part of that, philosophically and ideologically, because I am conservative. And that's just a group of people, and they may not even fully consider themselves all of them anti-capitalist, but they're people that say, hey, like, if we want to have what we consider from a right-wing perspective to be a beneficial society, a free and unfettered market is not a way that we can do that. And there's a lot of different schools of thought. If you want to really kind of dig into that world, American Affairs is a fantastic quarterly publication that I would put in that category. And they have a very broad breadth of thought. People that consider themselves anti-capitalist versus capitalist reformist, those things probably in practice aren't really all that different, right? And they even have some socialist writers sometimes write in their thing. But American Affairs is a right-wing publication, but definitely not a free markets publication. That is not American Affairs perspective. And it's been around a few years, and it's been growing like crazy, and a lot of good intellectual energy behind it. So that's one group of people that you'll see making that exact same connection that you're making. And that's starting to bleed over into mainstream politics just a tiny, teensy little bit. You will hear Josh Hawley, for instance, say things, a very watered down version of things that you might read in American Affairs. You'll see Tom Cotton say things, a very watered down version of things you might see in American Affairs. So they're not really there, but you can see where this is going. And then the other group of people are the people that still stick to sort of the old religion Marxism. And though that I don't want to get into terminology fights because a lot of them will quibble with what I'm about to say. A lot of those people are now referring to themselves as post-leftists to sort of distinguish themselves from the mainstream left. Some people don't like that term, but you could call, some of them prefer to be called left populists, whatever you want to say. Those are the two groups of people that you really see doing that. If you want to get like a good flavor of some of that thought, and again, it's a very broad area of thought. Not all of them are going to agree. Many of them would even disagree with the way I'm categorizing them. You want to read something like The Bellows, which is an online publication that's really great, really fantastic. If you want to get into that thought, What's Left is a really good podcast that's sort of that general genre. If you want to, kind of get some thought there. And then my friends who I was actually just live streaming with before I came on this podcast, the Good Old Boys kind of do a fusion of, I don't know if they would describe it this way, but they kind of do a fusion of those two camps that I talked about, people that are on the right and sort of the people that are in that post-left, area. They kind of sort of straddle those two and do a synthesis of those two. So for listeners that want to get a better idea of that school of thought that's sort of out there and developing, those are some resources that you can kind of look at.
I know you've touched on this in your writing, but I'm curious, like, how does inflation and the continuing effect, influence your thoughts? And maybe, like, what do you think would happen with capitalism today if we didn't have inflation, if we were on a hard money system?
So one of my controversial thoughts is that you actually can't have a hard money system long-term in capitalism because once capital is concentrated in a few enough hands that they're powerful enough, they're going to use some mechanism to control the money supply. Why wouldn't you? Like if you have the power to, if anyone has the power to do that, you'd be crazy not to do it, right? It's just it's in your own interest to do so. So I actually don't think I don't think those two things are compatible over a long enough time frame.
Yeah. I'm hoping, can you walk us through your other article about charity, welfare, and usury and the capitalist paradox? Because, I do agree with you that we're in the usury era. And how do we outline what was the charity era, the welfare era, and the usury era that I think I agree that we're in now?
So in early capitalism, when I say early capitalism, I'm talking. We can argue about when capitalism really started. I'm talking like post-industrial revolution, maybe up until like before the New Deal, somewhere in that ballpark, right? You had a situation. You have a competitive market. Distributists, which Block and Chesterton are the two probably most famous, have this concept called the capitalist paradox. And it basically means when you have this free market going on, and I'm adapting their ideas to modern day. They wrote over 100 years ago. So, but the way you would apply the capitalist paradox to more modern ideas, and even in their time, was if you got this competitive market, your goal is to be the last one standing. You're constantly competing. And the way you want to do that is by cutting costs, right? If you can offer an equivalently good product or service and you can offer it cheaper, you're going to win. So what's the easiest way to cut your costs? It's just to pay your employees less, right? I mean, that's always it's like a no-brainer. You typically in a market, you want to pay your employees as low as possible while still getting them to show up to work and do their job appropriately, right? So what's the problem with that? If everybody keeps cutting their employees' pay to try to compete with each other, eventually you're going to get to the point where the employee class or the working class, they're just subsisting, right? Like they're able to feed themselves and they're able to clothe themselves and they're able to get to work. And that's about it. They're not going to be able to buy your stuff. You know what I mean? And that's a problem because, if capital is concentrated such that, let's say, only 5 people have it, well, those 5 people only need so many shoes, no matter how luxurious their lifestyle might be. But if that capital is spread across 5 million people, they're going to buy a lot more shoes, right? So the paradox is that by trying to get ahead, you kind of end up impoverishing all your customers, right? And then they can't buy your stuff anymore. That's, in a nutshell, a very simplified version of the capitalist paradox. So the system, and when I say the system, that can be a governmental system or a non-governmental system. It doesn't really matter because in a capitalist society, a governmental system is going to be run by the larger holders of capital. So they can collude privately or they can collude out in the open via government. It doesn't really. Government is just a collusion mechanism, right? So they are going to have to find a way to funnel stuff back to the working classes so that they can keep buying things. So the initial way that was done early on was through charity. You were a billionaire, right? There weren't billionaires back then. You were a really rich guy.
Yep.
You were a Carnegie or a Rockefeller.
Yep.
You would just you would have all these charitable endeavors. And these charitable endeavors that were meant to help the poor, what they were really doing is just sort of keeping it was a way of recirculating capital back downwards to keep the system going. You had to find a way to constantly recirculate that capital downwards. And that charity stuff lasted for a while. But the problem was, there's not a formal mechanism to make sure that, all my other rich friends are giving as much to charity as I am, right? That can work for a while, but eventually that's going to break down. It's not sufficient anymore to recycle that capital back down to the working classes. So what we did next was basically the mid-century era, which was like the New Deal in the United States and other similar social democracy programs in Europe. That what they did was they actually implemented formalized systems through the government, right? So systems like Social Security, which I'm not even opposed to Social Security, but that was the point of it. That was the motivation behind it. Or other just welfare. I mean, just stuff like food stamps, general welfare payments, all that stuff that sort of really took off in the mid 20th century. That was the idea behind it. That was the mechanism to sort of recycle that down. And that worked really well for a while, particularly because during that era, you had two things going on. You had that welfare system, but you also actually had systems to gain workers more power, like unionization stuff that was also came about in that era. But what happened after the power systems broke down first for workers, and then eventually the welfare recirculation systems broke down, right? There was welfare reform in the 90s. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of those benefits started to get cut. And at the same time, you had offshoring going on. So people's wages went down even further. So that welfare system, it remained in place to some extent, but it wasn't cutting it anymore. Not enough capital was getting recirculated down. So what happened, in the phase that started from the 90s to the phase we're still in today, and that's the usury system, where you just lend it to them. You know what I mean? Like if you can't, these people are basically living on a borrowed lifestyle, right? I mean, we're a debt-based society. So that's another way you can funnel capital back down to them. And then they are able to then use that. They're not obviously, using it as capital, investing it. They're just using it to spend to live or on consumable items or, things of that nature. So that's the other way to do it. And the usury system is really advantageous because they get to charge interest, right? So they not only they make money on selling you stuff, but they make money on the fact that they gave you the money to buy it in the beginning to begin with. You know what I'm saying? So there's money's being made at all angles there when you're dealing with a usury system. And I should point out here that usury, I'm using Hilaire Belloc's definition of the term. So usury nowadays we define as charging an amount of interest that's so high that it's unethical or illegal. But that's not what it meant in the distributist tradition. It essentially meant any loan that was for, I'm going to simplify a little bit here, for a consumable asset. So like a mortgage would not have necessarily
I believe a 30-year mortgage should be illegal.
Well, okay. So I was going to use that as an example that wasn't necessary. Not everyone would consider usury.
I do. I think it's usury.
Okay.
I do. And I think it plays a big part into our economy and to how people view their homes. And we can get into how Germany treats homes. But I do think a 30-year mortgage, whether it works for you or not, I'm not saying I don't have one. I just do think it's a form of usury.
Yeah, and it can be depending on the terms of them. I'll give you a more clear-cut example. If you took out an equipment loan to buy a machine for your business, that loan would not be usury.
Right.
Okay, because you're using it for productive purpose. However, credit card debt that you use to buy food, no matter how low the interest is, that's still considered usury under this school of thought, right? That should be illegal. That sort of lending.
And your home is consumption.
Should be against.
It's not an investment. I mean, it shouldn't be seen as an investment. You live there. You're consuming that entity, that asset.
I fundamentally agree with the idea that you should view your home as a place to live and not as a financial investment. I do fundamentally agree with you there.
And only because of low interest rates and 30-year mortgages and money printing has it been an investment and a salvation for many Americans. But I agree. But I don't think that's
because it's just something that's not dollars. Right.
Yeah, and I just don't think that's the way we should be building our economy. I think it's a form of rent seeking, and it prices young people out of a very usable, consumable asset that they should be able to afford. And I think college debt is the same way, and I think you've touched upon it in your writing.
College debt is, yes, a very good example.
I mean, what banker would give an 18-year-old $200,000 to go find out what he's going to pay it back with in 4 years.
Yeah.
Go try asking a bank to help you start a business when you're 18 years old with no experience and no clients, no revenue, no contracts.
And that's a distortion just caused by the federal guarantee
Right.
of student loans, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. So I, it's like I read your writing and I'm blown away. I love it. And I want to know where you like, well, one, we haven't really touched a lot about what is a populist.
Excuse me, you could define that a million different ways, but
well, how do you define it? You call yourself one. It's considered probably a dirty word, maybe, or not the. I don't know many people who like run around saying I'm a populist.
Yeah, I mean, it just means that, you view the point of governance, let's say, to be fundamentally for the people, and meaning that, but it's rhetorical in a lot of ways. That it can be just the way that you speak. Is that the whole point of what we're doing is for the people, but not for any abstraction. In other words, we're not running a government to increase GDP or based on some ideological concern like we just view a free market as inherently good because it's inherently good, and that's how we run our government. A populist, you'd look at what really is benefiting actually the people, regardless of your ideological concerns. That is your primary concern. I think when you're a populist, and to me, and populists come in all, there are left populists and right populists and all different sorts of populism. But to me, it sort of implies like what I consider like a national worker state, meaning a government based in nationalism, which should not be a dirty word. Nationalism doesn't have to be racist. It doesn't have to be anything like that. And the point of the government should be essentially to represent the workers in all forms, which also includes, this is where I'm not a Marxist, I mean, that also includes self-employed people who work. Self-employed people typically do work in their business. They are also workers. They're a different class of workers than employees are. They have different concerns. They take different risks, et cetera. But I don't know. Hopefully, I rambled a little bit.
No, it's great.
If I answered your question.
No, I loved it. How do you frame up the difference between like, or the goals of sovereignty versus populism? Like thinking about others versus taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. There's a duality there where in your personal life, it makes sense to be like a libertarian because you're going to have the best life if you look at the world through the lens of, everything's on me. I got to do the best I can. When I fail, it's my fault. You know what I mean? That sort of thinking is going to get you far in life on a personal level. It also is an insane way to run a government in that you're just going to have a situation where you're going to have a few winners that come out dominating everyone else. And that is self-contradictory, but I don't have an answer to that contradiction.
Sure.
It's sort of is what it is.
And like, how do you frame up distributism? Like, if we're going to define it, and I'll let you know what I've gathered from it because I listened to you on other podcasts. And I ran home and I told my wife about it. And the way I frame it up is, we're going to distribute economic ownership, maybe not property ownership, but throughout the population. And I use the example of Amazon, which I think you spoke about, but like Amazon gets so big. So once it achieves a certain size, and that's where I don't know how we determine that size, but like you're like, okay, we need to have 20% of the employees represented maybe on the board of directors. And that scenario, and I'm paraphrasing you, so now we're not going to have 2-day delivery because I'm not going to piss and shit in my pants. I'm not going to wear diapers as an employee. So we're going to be on 4-day delivery. And, everyone's not going to get what they want or, the most supreme service, but we're going to balance that by not having people wearing diapers in a factory or old people commuting to the best jobs around the country to work in Amazon factories or whatever it is. But how do I build it out more than that?
Sure. So distributism is primarily just an ideal, meaning saying that you respect private property. So that's where it makes it a little bit different from, let's say, like a communist, right? For instance, you very much respect private property, but you want to use the legal system to corral the market such that private property remains very widely distributed, and that capital
decentralized.
Maintains. Decentralization is interesting. We're going to go back to that.
Sorry.
And that capital itself maintains wide distribution, which a free market's not going to provide that. So you need a system in place to sort of hamper the market, essentially, that such a thing can happen. And distributists throughout the 100-year history of it, have had a lot of different ideas about the best way to do that. So it's hard to say like, oh, this is a distributist policy versus this isn't. I can tell you the ones that I think are good ideas, and I'll get into that. But many people that call them distributists would disagree very much with my ideas, because it's more so an ideal that's never been fully implemented. So from my perspective, what might that look like in the real world? And I'm going to answer that in two ways. Actually, I'm going to answer it first into things you could actually do, let's say, within the next 30 years that are like marginally realistic. And then we can talk about like pie in the sky stuff, right? I think those are two different aspects that we can look at. So when we're talking about this, first of all, it's important to understand the concept of subsidiarity, which is different than pure decentralization. Subsidiarity means power is exercised at the lowest level in which it can be effectively exercised, not the lowest level altogether. Because if you fully decentralize things, what usually ends up happening is the strongest guy in this little decentralized world will essentially end up dominating everybody else, and you'll end right up back at a centralized system. That's what a free market is, decentralized at the beginning, right? So that's what happens. Subsidiarity says you push just enough power up the different levels of government such that everybody's still getting a piece. That's the idea behind this system. Everybody gets a little piece of what's going on, and it's in everybody's interest to keep that higher level of authority running such that everybody's still getting their piece, and not no one can dominate that higher level of government. That's easier said than done. But I'll give you some examples of things that would, I think, move a little bit closer to a distributist ideal, but are still somewhat realistic. So, number one of those things would be, as you said, I think that publicly traded, first of all, obviously, real easy one, tax and regulatory policy that favors non-public small family businesses over large publicly traded businesses. And that's just a value judgment. So like if you're a libertarian and you're hearing that sounds insane, but like, no, I'm actually saying the legal system should discriminate against, businesses that are held that way and in favor of the smaller ones, even if they are less efficient, to the degree that's acceptable. And we'll talk about in a minute, there are some businesses that just like a utility company can't necessarily operate that way. But your tax and regulatory structure, in fact, benefits directly those types of businesses. When you're talking about larger businesses that really can't operate that way. So let me give concrete examples. Restaurants would be a good example of that. There is no benefit to having a Chili's on every corner versus family restaurants in every town, right? There isn't. That's stupid. But you, on the other end of the spectrum, you wouldn't necessarily want a different wireless communication, like a different cell phone company in every town, right? That would be difficult, just the nature of that industry. So when you're talking about those industries that are not easily that just don't lend themselves to that, those industries just have to be very regulated. And there's a variety of different ways that you can do that. Number one would be, you mentioned one, where those industries they're going to have to give their workers seats on the board. So you know what I mean? Because that is a form of distributed control, even if it's not, ideally you would want companies like that to be co-ops. That's the distributist ideal. A co-op is essentially a business where the workers own it. It's not socialism, right? Because there's still a market in play that, we don't all in a society own AT&T, but AT&T's employees own AT&T. T-Mobile's employees own T-Mobile. But it's still run like a corporation in that they elect a board of directors and there's still a president. And you know what I mean? And this is a business model that does exist. Mondragon is an industrial cooperative, a very large one actually in Spain that operates that way. Their employees own the business. And that doesn't mean everybody gets paid the same. The janitor doesn't get paid what the CEO does. But, there are ways to make that work. That's ideal. It would be hard to really transition to that system right away or anytime in the near future. So in the meantime, I think what Germans call the co-determination system, because they do this in their country, is a step in that direction and probably the best that we can do right now. And that says, look, once your company is over a certain size, and we can determine that's an arbitrary line, but arbitrary lines are just something that has to be drawn. We could use being publicly traded as that line. We could do it by revenue. You come up with a million different ways to do this. You have to have your employees are going to elect, half your board of directors. You're not actually going to operate solely for your shareholders anymore. Your employees are going to have a seat at this table. They're going to have actual agency over their jobs and what they do every day. So that's a baby step, sort of in that direction when we can't get to that co-op level. Something that I've been sold on to over time is a move more towards corporatist government. And when I say corporatist, I mean corporatist in the tripartite tradition. And if you want to learn more about that, American Affairs, maybe 2 issues ago, Michael Lind wrote an article about tripartite corporatism. It's ironic that I'm citing him because he's not a distributist. He actually likes very centralized businesses. But tripartite corporatism is not limited to that sort of a system. And a tripartite corporatist system is one where, so right now, administrative agencies are just that set regulations for our business environment are just staffed by career bureaucrats, right? It's just sort of how it works. In a corporatist system, it wouldn't work that way. So let's say the agency that, or the division of the agency that, let's say, we use cell phones already, that's controlling wireless telecommunication. Instead of being staffed by bureaucrats, what would happen is the government would legally sanction and recognize a union that represented all of the telecommunications workers. The workers actually would not be required to join the union. They would only if they don't want to pay dues, and France does this, by the way. This is not a pie in the sky thing. They don't have to join the union if they don't want to pay dues. They don't get to vote in the union elections, but they don't have to join, right? So this union is sanctioned by the government. And then the employers would have their own industry association, also sanctioned by the government. And then consumers in that particular industry would also have an organization sanctioned by the government. I'm describing it a little bit differently than Lind does, but it's the same general idea as Lind envisions this. And those 3 entities, all who have competing interests, would sit down at the table and hammer out the regulatory structure that is best for the 3 of them, instead of a bureaucrat that is detached from the consequences of his actions, right? So the union is obviously incentivized to hammer out the best deal for the employees. The employers association is incentivized to hammer out the best deal in the regulatory environment for the employer. Now, if you had just those 2, they might agree to screw consumers, right? So that's the third leg of the stool here in terms of who are actually coming up with the regulatory environments for these businesses. So they hammer out a regulatory environment that works for all 3 of them. And it's an everybody gets a piece system. It's actually fundamentally a patronage system. where everybody's just looking out for their own interests and using the government to patronize themselves. But because you have competing interests that are opposed to one another, everybody's competing to make sure they still get their piece. And that's sort of the idea behind this. Everybody gets a piece. You know what I mean? That's the sort of overarching thing here.
So where do you think we're going in 2021?
Well, I mean, right now, certainly not in that direction, right? If things get better, they're going to get worse first. And I'm not saying they will get better. Right now, we're moving more and more towards that servile state system.
Yeah.
I think UBI proposals are going to get a lot more serious. It's not going to be a pie in the sky Andrew Yang thing anymore. I don't know that we'll see it yet actually enacted as a policy, but that's a thing you're going to start to see a lot more people talking about. Because I'm very opposed to the UBI. It basically strips everyone of their power and agency. It also just, human nature is such that people need a purpose in life, and they need to work. They need to do something. That doesn't mean they have to work a brutally hard job, but they got to have a reason to get up in the morning. And UBI is just it's not good, right? So I think you're going to start to see the UBI and other sorts of policies that might be designed to accomplish UBI type goals.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're headed in the short to medium term.
Yeah, man. This has been so awesome. I really appreciate just kind of grokking everything you've been throwing out there. I think I want to hear more from you everywhere. I think you just need to be out there more. Any parting words? And definitely let everyone know where we could find you.
Yeah, so I mean, the easiest way to find me is on Twitter. I'm sure you'll post that in the show notes or whatever. And then if you're interested in the IRA or 401k product that we talked about at the beginning of the show, you can go to keykeeperira.com and you can check out all that info. That's
awesome, bro. This has been so dope. I really appreciate it, Jeff.
No problem, man. I really appreciate you having me on, and it's been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, man. This has been great. Peace. Jeff Vandroux, defining and expanding on the political economy and what's happening right now, right here on the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. And thank you for listening. If you dig the chats, vote with your thumbs and press 5 stars in that app, and subscribe to our brand new YouTube channel. That's the best way to get the word out so we can keep grinding out thought-provoking conversations about Bitcoin and the economy. This is Sed. Peace out.